We're about 18 months away from the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country with the Declaration of Independence. And if you have a chance to read it between now and 18 months, you will notice early on in the Declaration, the authors said they were writing it out of, quote, a decent regard for the opinion of mankind, unquote. In those days, we apparently had no women. The entire world was just mankind. But they were concerned about how the U.S. appeared to the world, especially since at that time the colonies were rebelling from England and were on the edge of a major war for independence. And that's where public diplomacy really begins. In fact, Claire and I on the book are finding that all of the things we're studying about public diplomacy and international education were pretty much familiar to the founding fathers. Again, apparently there were women involved in anything. And that there was a concern even among universities that the universities had their own foreign policies. So we've always had this unusual situation in America where Washington has a foreign policy and Washington Square has a foreign policy. And it's essential for universities, maybe even more important than ever now, to have your own foreign policy and know what part of the world you want to engage with at the student and scholar level and why. When the Declaration was signed, we already had 9 colleges in America. All of them had foreign students and all of them took in foreign scholars. Mainly the flow was south to north. Alexander Hamilton, of course, from the Caribbean, coming to what became Columbia University because Princeton didn't want him. But we had always opened our doors to international students, and we needed to open our doors to faculty because it takes some years to develop faculty. Even though Harvard started in 1636, by 1776, we were heavily dependent on the Scottish Enlightenment for medicine, science, and a whole bunch of things that we really didn't have homegrown faculty to teach. So we have a long connection between public diplomacy, international education, foreign policy in Washington, and the interests and foreign policies of state and local institutions, public and private. I've been asked to talk about the impact of all of this on diplomacy, the economy, and knowledge. And I'll do that very briefly and then take as many questions as you possibly have, because we learn far more from you than we actually impart. One of my particular interests in the field of diplomacy is what do our diplomats and what do our senators and Congress women and men on the foreign relations committees think about the role that international education, foreign students plays in their diplomatic missions. And I can't tell you how many cabinet officers, senators, representatives say, you know, I made a trip to country X to negotiate something. The topic was very, very difficult, and I was apprehensive. But when I walked in the room, the first thing their foreign minister or national security advisor said is, I'm a graduate of NYU, Stanford, Harvard, Georgetown, you name it. Or my kids went to NYU, Harvard, Stanford, Illinois, Indiana, and it broke the ice. I know you can't do a whole dissertation called Breaking the Ice, but it sure matters when you're in a hot spot dealing with a difficult regime, difficult situation, to know that you have immediately something in common. I often think of our energy secretary um, and the energy secretary of Iran negotiating the joint agreement on controlling nuclear stuff in Iran. They both are grads of MIT. And as much as everything would be against them liking each other or talking with each other or actually coming up with an agreement, which they did, uh, there was something about the bond that if you or your children study at our schools, it makes a difference in diplomatic outcomes. So Sharif and I, 2 weeks ago, were in China, met with the U.S. ambassador, who was a professor at the Kennedy School. I must have met 15 of his students who are now Chinese officials heading scholarship councils, who said, oh, I had Ambassador Burns for this course or that course. At one time, I counted in the members of the Politburo, 2/3 of the Politburo of China had kids at either Harvard or Stanford. And I used to interview the kids that are at Harvard when they came back. And what difference did education make to you? What difference did the 4 years make to you? What I was really interested in, and eventually could get, is what difference did it make to your father or your mother who's on the Politburo? How did this experience you had translate back into something that made policy in China or changed a Chinese policy? And I've always been struck with the impact that the open doors the United States has to international students and the experience they've had here, because most of them go back, what impact it has on society, family, community, policy. And I'm not sure anyone has been able to tackle that yet in a dissertation. It's hard to get at that other than sitting down with someone and saying, trace the decision that your father or mother made back to what you learned at the Kennedy School or back to what you learned about our democracy. But I'm sure there are things there, just like breaking the ice, that really make a difference to our diplomacy. Economics and business, it's pretty easy to know the impact of international students. In this decade, 25% of all businesses with annual revenues over $1 billion were founded by international students. Could be founded abroad, they could be founded here, but there's no doubt that one of the sources of our economic growth and dynamism is what foreign students do if they're able to remain here and choose to, or what they do for us in our companies when they go back home and either get hired by an American-based company or an American-founded company, or they found their own business and say, you know, who do I want to do business with? And it's somebody in some place in the United States. So the economy is enriched in so many different ways. Mirka mentioned this morning that the Commerce Department's latest estimate of the value that international students bring to America is 50 billion. We have 1 million international students. The UK calculates it differently. They have about 400,000 international students, and they say that the value that international students bring to the United Kingdom is about 50 billion. Now, they have way fewer students than we do, many fewer universities than we do. If the Commerce Department calculated things the way the government of Great Britain calculates it, we would not have 50 billion, but it would be closer probably to 100 billion. there's no question that these students make a difference in so many different ways to our society, community, and our economy. And they will continue to do that. Businesses will continue to be founded by international students. So, Jen mentioned the Benjamin Gilman scholarships, which are now about 20 years old. And they're scholarships for American citizens on Pell Grants to study abroad for a semester. Could be a whole year. Basic grant is $5,000. And when we started, we wondered if we'd get any applications, because a student on a Pell Grant often has their own family or is working in the family business. And they can't go away for a semester, and sometimes it's a source of income for siblings or their family. I think we had 13,000 applications last year for 3,000 fellowships. But at the beginning, we weren't sure. We were sure that there were students who wanted to study abroad on Pell Grants, but we didn't quite know how to identify them. God bless the financial aid offices, because they weren't coming into the International Studies office, but people in financial aid knew that, gee, I've met this student and they'd like to go abroad. Maybe they're going to have trouble with their parents. That's why we published the first Guide to Study Abroad, and then we published a separate book called A Parent's Guide to Study Abroad, and we had an English and a Spanish version. And now the new book in English and Spanish is The Family Guide to Study Abroad, because it is a different decision when you're a Pell Grant student, maybe, than when you're not a Pell Grant. But I wondered how they could make ends meet. And so we interviewed early recipients, and my job was to take Texas and met a fellow who from San Antonio went to Bangkok, Thailand. And I was first thinking, my God, the airfare alone must have taken half of the Gilman grant. But I wanted to see how he made ends meet. It turned out he found a round trip ticket for $700. That left the rest of the money to spend. He sent half of it back to his family in San Antonio. And he lived for a semester, completed his studies, went back to UT, and he still had money in his pocket. I asked, what was the impact of this experience on you and your family? He said, oh, I learned about a part of the world he said all the right things. But he said, it really made a difference to my mom, because she runs a house cleaning business, 6 employees, and she wanted to try to expand her business. And I told her about what I saw in Bangkok. There are house cleaning businesses, and the ones that are succeeding say we use environmentally safe products. So he said, I told my mom, why don't you advertise that you're going to only use environmentally safe products? In the first year, she went from 60 employees to 60 because of something he saw, not part of his studies in Thailand, but something he saw that he thought might make a difference at home. And I think behind every Gilman student, and probably many students that study abroad, is that experience of seeing something there and translating it back to something that makes a difference at home. And that resonates with Congress. We try to visit every year all 85 members of the appropriations committees of both the House and the Senate. We start on the far right and go to the far left. We start with the most conservative. And we always bring to the visit one of their constituents who had the experience of a Fulbright or a Gilman And what they don't say is, oh, it was fabulous. I really enjoyed my time abroad and I've never gotten to see. They start with, I had this experience that I brought back home to our district. And now we have this program or that program, which I first observed in South Africa or London and everything in between. And that's why Fulbright has, even today, strong bipartisan support in both houses and the highest level of funding in the program's history. Because representatives and senators get a real taste for what this does when someone has the experience and comes back home. So there are many, many dissertation topics that can grow out of understanding the impact not only of the person being there, but having been there, coming back home to make a difference to their community. And finally, there's the impact of these exchanges on human knowledge. We're privileged in the Institute since our founding to have 109 Nobel Prizes that are awarded to international students and Fulbrights who have been under our care and go someplace, and it's in the lab at MIU, or it's in the lab at Imperial College, or it's in the lab in Brazil. They get to wonder about something. They see something. They put a connection together. Sometimes the laureates tell me it was if I had stayed in Brazil or if I had stayed in my home country, it would take me 10 years to get inside the lab to do something, the something that becomes the experiment that wins the Nobel Prize in physics, for example, chemistry. But when I came to America, I realized that even as an undergraduate, I could have access to a lab with the equipment that only the most senior professors at home would be able to use. And I began tinkering with this and tinkering with that. And then I asked a colleague and friend, and 20 years later, it's recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee. It happens that way. So knowledge is immeasurably enriched by people who have had Fulbrights and all the other ingredients that add up to advancing scientific discovery and also humanism. I mentioned our trip to China. Usually when I'm there, I try to always meet with the Fulbright students that are currently there. We don't now have a Fulbright program with China, so I didn't have the chance to do that this time. But I'll never forget meeting a PhD candidate from Ohio State University. She was double majoring, if you call it that, in environmental studies and biology. Being there a year in a very remote village in Western and Northern China to study organisms in Chinese river water. So I asked her, what's in the river water? And she said, you don't want to know. But I brought a whole bunch of my samples to Beijing to go through a lab to have them tested. Oh, I said, is that why you're here? And she says, not really. In this very remote village, which has never had an American in it before, 3 months before there was a car accident and a mother and a father were killed and a little girl was left as an orphan. And she needed a very serious cranial operation to try to fix what had been damaged in the crash. She said, there's a Lutheran hospital that I know, and I'm here really to see if I can arrange for her to have the operation. had nothing to do with Fulbright and everything to do with Fulbright. That's what we want. That's what we need, to have young Americans go someplace very remote and represent the United States. The people in the village will never forget her. She did arrange for the operation. It was pretty successful. We couldn't bring her mother and father back to life, but a couple in our Beijing office adopted her. She's doing well. She's about 15 years old now, thinking about entering college. But that would have never happened if we didn't have this form of public diplomacy. So it's sometimes not where you study or what you study, but what we as Americans do. We step up. And again, there's a terrific dissertation topic here, but we don't capture enough of those students to say what difference it made to have an American, like in the Peace Corps in some remote place, that steps up and does something that's sometimes pretty uniquely American. I'll conclude by saying that this has been a terrific International Education Week. Mirka launched it on Monday with the live stream, well, a video recording, and then we've done half a dozen panels and other things in New York, Washington, Dubai, Prague, and around the world. There's a part of this year's story that is not yet fully explored, and I'm going to share it with you now. 10 countries in the world are the destination for about 70% of all international students. You can imagine the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, China, Spain, Australia. I'm missing one, but I think you get the picture. There's just a few countries that receive the 6.5 million internationally mobile students that there are today. In the past 12 months, the landscape has dramatically changed. Russia don't want any more international students. China's unsure. It was on the path to eclipse the UK as being the #2 destination country until COVID came, and their total lockdown policy became world news. Canada, during the pandemic, replaced the UK as the #2 destination, 800,000 international students. There's now a cap on how many international students go to Canada. I think it's 400,000. Not enough housing. Caps have been instituted in Australia. They're close to doing that in the case of France. The new government in Germany, moving further to the right, may introduce caps. And the national agencies of every single country that is in the business of promoting international students to come to their country have had budget cuts between 6 and 33%. Every country except one has reached what I would call capacity. 25% international student enrollment, some are 38%. We're at 6%. We're facing an enrollment cliff by 2025. We'll have 2 million fewer American citizens going to higher ed because they weren't born in 2008. And that enrollment cliff will stay with us for the rest of the decade. We have 4,000 colleges and universities. No other country comes close to that many. We could be the only education capital of the world. We don't have to build more buildings. We don't have to train more faculty. We don't have to equip more labs. They're all here. Now, not everybody's going to go to Harvard or Stanford. Can't fit. But we're on the edge of 5 years where we'll have unparalleled capacity to go from 1.1 million international students to 2 million. Mirka and I will be charting that every January or so. We're going to be producing Forecast 2030. What does it show about where we are? What are the trajectory lines? But in my experience, we've never had an opportunity so singular to be the world's education capital. And part of the reason I'm so confident is because universities have foreign policies. And they have managed to, in good times and bad times, make sure that our doors stay as wide open as they possibly can be. So you're in a very exciting field. The international dimension of it is dramatically shifting and changing before your eyes. You'll have a chance to see what growing from 1 to 2 million means at a time when the rest of the world's, and that was mentioned this morning, they don't have the domestic capacity at home in Brazil, Nigeria, China, India, big countries. So there will be the need, because this 18 to 24-year-old demographic is explosively growing, to get higher education. And my bet is they're going to come here. NYU for a decade has been the leading host of international students. I keep asking Sharif, could you double it? He keeps saying, where is the dormitories? But there's so many US institutions that have only 500 or 1,000. And they're going to have many fewer Americans because they weren't born coming to their schools. And I think the field you're in and the studies you're going to do are going to help us all show the way. With that, thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I'll start.
Okay,
Since I have
thank
the
you.
mic in my hand. This might not be a completely fair question, but we started today talking about some of the challenges and tensions that we feel. And I really appreciate all of your comments, and you've painted this amazing picture about the crucial role of public diplomacy and why we do all these things. Yet, I just feel like we live in a very different moment right now. And I just want to, I just kept thinking as you were talking, like this is an almost unrecognizable country when we think of, right-wing Christian, white supremacist nationalism that's rising in this country. We think of the corporate takeover of boards of universities that are going to increasingly be challenging the curriculum, what we teach at this institution, what we stand for here, the kind of absolute suppression of academic freedom. And I just wonder, I mean, as you were painting this amazing picture and the importance of the work we do, I just kept sitting here thinking, yes, but there's incredible pressures that are going to be bestowed upon universities. We organized a big protest in March and discussion in Florida in March. And what DeSantis has done there in shutting down programs, silencing people, the anti-immigration rhetoric. This is the US right now. And what is the role of universities? How can we think of the real stakes and the ways that we could do public diplomacy through the work we do, given the reality that is around us all of the time, not just in the US, but autocratic governments around the world, the kind of what's happening across Europe with white supremacy and, ethno-nationalism, and in many other places, the attacks on particularly universities, because they are the intellectual capital of the countries, and the challenges to those governments. So I don't know if you can, I don't know if anybody could answer that, but I just kept thinking there's got to be a role in how do we think about what we could do at our own institutions, and also in the broader way of working with other organizations to protect democracy, to protect academic freedom, to use public diplomacy and the power that we do wield, but also to challenge our own institutions for suppression of academic freedom and those things. So the rest of you can think about other questions.
I hope it was on the record because that's a really good list of all the things that I'm worried about too. But I have one experience that maybe helps me navigate this period. We celebrated our centennial in 2019 and published a book on the history of IIE. And I volunteered to do the timeline. Note to the wise, never volunteer to do a timeline. But it was so valuable to me, starting and reading every single annual report from 1919 onward. Tried to summarize the highlights, what we did. And remember, this is the middle of the Spanish flu. We had 10 more pandemics in the 100 years to go through. We had a world war. We had the Cultural Revolution. We had countless coups that we were behind in destabilizing South America and Iran. There was the Great Depression, the rise of Senator McCarthyism, loyalty oaths, boards of regents telling UC Berkeley what they could and couldn't teach. And going through each of the reports, I concluded, first of all, that we had 3 really good years. When the director was not worried about money, was not worried about the state of the world, where policies in Washington seemed to be aligned with us. The first was 1928. Now that we were just coming off a decade of isolationism, the economy was booming, the stock market was booming, colleges and universities, people were thinking more and more to go to them. You know what happened in 1929. I think 1962 was a pretty good year. We had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had an administration in Washington that Kennedy was the only president in history to receive Fulbrighters in the Rose Garden. Donald Trump is the only president in history that wrote a letter to every incoming Fulbright saying, we're glad you're here. It's an important program. Glad you'll be ambassadors for your country and help us understand ours. It's a wonderful letter. This is not fake news. But 62 is a pretty good year. But then we had the assassination in Vietnam, and after 9/11 was another good year when we were not worried about the government. We were not worried about funding because George Bush had increased the Fulbright program by at least a third, realizing that Fulbright needs to be the public diplomacy ambassadors, especially to the Arab world, the Gulf, and Muslim world, so that they don't think, as he put it, that we all hate them. So 2002 was a really good year, but that means 97 of those 100 years were real turkeys. But But what also came through in doing this is that we found, and our university partners found, a way to keep the doors open when it was unpopular, to engage with the world when we had 2 decades of isolationism, neutrality. When World War II started, we had to stop rescuing scholars from Germany, stop exchanges with Europe. But we discovered that south of Washington, D.C., there's 50 countries called South America, and opened offices in almost all of them. And the flow of students south to north in most cases continued against all odds. So there is something about IIE, our university partners, and universities themselves, which mean that we're going to get through this. There is a reason that there are only 3 continuously functioning organizations today that existed 1,000 years ago. One is the Catholic Church, the other is the British monarchy, and the third are universities. Yes, there were dark ages, and yes, there was McCarthy, but universities have a way of surviving. They have a resilience that, because every society has them, and the arc of their history tends to bend over time to freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, even though we may live for a decade in the opposite. So I share all of your worries, but I really come away with a different perspective, having dug myself into this timeline and realized we've been here before. Thank you.
Thank you.